Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, and maybe some have come in since then, you might have missed it, we do have a little handout for this evening. So if you didn't get a handout on your way in, maybe give a little raised hand. After Colby passes them out, he's going to put them on the back tables there in the back if somebody wants to get one of these handouts. So we'll look at this a little bit tonight together. I also brought something else with me tonight. I brought this book right here. So recently, a graduate of ACU published this really impressive illustrated children's Bible. And I almost even kind of hesitate to call it a children's Bible because in a way it's more geared toward being a work of art than it is a children's Bible. It kind of is formatted like a children's Bible, giving little snippets of the hallmark stories of the Bible. But each and every one of them has these like original watercolor works of art in them that are just really dazzling to look at. I found it really interesting. I was going to show you some on the screen, but I couldn't find this book until about like 3 minutes before I left the house. I probably looked for it for about 20 minutes. Alyssa looked for it for 20 seconds, and then I was able to go out the house with this. It happens about once a week that I'm looking around for something, and then she finds it right away. But I'll be glad to show you this afterwards if you want to see some of these pictures that are in this book. So recently after this came out, ACU had a little interview with this author. His name is Brian Duane, who wrote this book and illustrated it himself as well. And they were just asking him some questions about the book. And it was so fascinating to hear him talk about the process of, like, the creative challenge of illustrating a Bible story. Because nobody took pictures back then. We don't know what this looked like. And sometimes the things that happen in the Bible are so incredible, it's hard to get our brains around what they are. And so there's this beautiful challenge for an artist of how do I illustrate this story? How can I make this story come vividly to life, not just with words, but a visual? So I was thinking about this book and this idea as I was prepping for our last lesson in this series. And tonight, I'm not sure how this is going to work, but I want to try something. So I've got this little handout for you, and it's a little printed booklet. And inside the booklet, you'll find a Bible story, not word for word. It's something that I've paraphrased the story for the sake of this. And if you look at it, you can see that the bottom half of each page is where the Bible story is, and then the top half of the page is blank, kind of like the format you would see in a children's Bible where the illustrations would go. Now, before all of our artistically challenged people groan and worry, I'm not going to make you draw anything tonight. I suppose you could pick up that little pencil there with the attendance cards and whip out some beautiful sketch of the story that you're going to be looking at, but I'm not going to require that of anybody this evening. Probably somebody could do a great job of that. I could not. But tonight, what I want you to do, as we read this story, I do want you to use your imagination. And as you hear this story read in just a moment, I want you to imagine you were the one responsible for filling that top half of that page with an illustration or a visual, and that you had the skills to pull it off. I'm going to be imagining that for myself. Imagine that you are in charge of illustrating this story. What would you do? Make sense? Everybody in here got one? Okay. The story. Once there was a father who had a beloved son. And this father sent out his son to look for the boy's brothers, the father's other sons, who, as it turns out, were not where they had said that they would be. So obediently, the beloved son went as his father told him, and he found them. But when he found them, the brothers turned on him, betrayed him, and the next thing you know, the beloved son had been cast aside. He was friendless, alone, beaten, stripped, cast down into a pit, a wasted life. That's how it seemed. But God was not finished with him yet. God saw the suffering of this beloved son, and he used it for good. God raised him up from the pit and seated him on a throne. This cast aside and rejected one became a source of salvation for many, and everyone bowed down at his feet. And then a remarkable thing happened. This son, beloved by his father, rejected by his brothers, saw those brothers again. There were 11 of them. He knew them immediately. But they never thought they would see his face again. When they spoke of him, they called him the one who is no more. So, of course, they didn't recognize him when they first saw him. But this thing that the brothers had done was weighing heavily upon them. These 11 were truly sorry for what they'd done before, but what could they do about it now? What had happened, happened. There was no changing that. The way they had treated this brother of theirs, how could it ever be erased? The mark of it was upon them, like the blood that soaked their brother's torn and tattered robes, a stain too dark to cleanse. This is what they thought. Until, most unexpectedly, the once rejected, now exalted, beloved Son of the Father revealed himself to his brothers. He was alive, not dead. He was not the one who is no more. Here he stands alive. The fact that their brother was standing before them, alive and well, this fact sent shockwaves down the spines of the 11 brothers. But there were other facts to consider as well. And these facts were concerning. The fact remained that they had betrayed their brother. Somehow he was alive, but not because of anything they had done to help him. They had done a terrible thing. And the fact remained that their brother was now quite formidable. The last time they saw him, he'd seemed so toothless, so helpless. Sure, he'd said a lot of big things about himself and his destined purpose, his specialness. But when they turned on him, he was easily subdued, like picking on a lamb from a flock of sheep. Subduing him was nothing. But now he was so obviously something they'd never seen before. And one more fact remained. This brother of theirs had every right to be angry, even vengeful toward them. If he turned on them, it would be well-deserved. So the 11 brothers braced themselves when the one began to speak. But he was not angry with them. He was not vengeful. He told them, "Do not be afraid." He told them how much he wanted to see his father again. And how glad he was to see them again, believe it or not. And as impossible as it had seemed for this brother to be alive, the way that he was treating them now, somehow this seemed even more impossible. Yet with each word, he simply reassured them, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. There you have the little story. And we've been doing this Wednesday night series for long enough now that you know exactly whose story that is. If you were drawing the illustrations, you're probably filling the pages in your mind right this minute with images from the life of Joseph. Joseph, who was sent by his father, Jacob. Joseph, who brothers beat him and threw him into the pit. Joseph, whom God raised up from the pit, raised him to prominence in Egypt. Joseph, who met those same brothers again, met them face to face, looked them in the eyes, and forgave them, reassured them, even embraced them. We spent basically half of this whole spring looking at the story of Joseph. But the one thing that I have left to talk about this story, really the last thing we're going to cover for Joseph and for this series, is about this last part right here. the most famous words that come out of Joseph's mouth, and we haven't really spent much time talking about this yet. But in that climactic scene where Joseph forgives his brothers, Joseph says these amazing words, "You intended it for evil, but God intended it for good." You intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. And we can't talk about Joseph and not talk about that. So the question that's been going around in my mind about this part of our passage, this part of the life of Joseph, is this: what good exactly did God bring out of Joseph's story? What good did God bring forth from the life of Joseph? Joseph looks his brothers who had treated him so harshly, looks them in the eye and said, "You may have meant all of that for evil, but God was working good in all of that and in my life." Even in the strife-filled and at times heartbreaking life of Joseph, what good did God bring out of that? The answer, I think you know, is so much good. And the answer I think I would give tonight is so much more good than even Joseph, who says these words, might have ever known. And that's saying something, because Joseph in his own lifetime came to see a lot of good emerge out of his turmoil-filled life with his brothers and in Egypt. Joseph saw with his own eyes that God was, in fact, able to redeem those heartbreaks that he had throughout his life and give value to his struggle. And he saw it in so many different ways, like from the physical salvation of many starving people who wouldn't have had food to eat, were it not for the fact that God had been working through Joseph's life, working for good. Joseph saw it in the reconciliation of his family, his brothers, and also his father. We really focus on the brother part, but you know how much Joseph longed to see his father for those many years that he was alive in Egypt. And yet they were apart, but God brought them back together. He intended it for good. Joseph's life, in spite of what he went through, gave a good name to the Lord in Egypt, where they knew very little about him. God did that. God found so many ways to turn the evil and the struggle in Joseph's life into something it wasn't to start with, something good, something valuable. And Joseph has a front row seat to all of that. He's actually actively participating in it, and it's through his faithfulness that God is doing all of these things. But what if I told you that the good that God brings out of the life of Joseph in his own lifetime was just the beginning of the good that God would bring from Joseph's life? And God's good intentions in redeeming what was wrong in his story are even bigger than what his own story can contain. And we have a whole lot of the Old Testament that we could look at to support that thought. But tonight I want to take it a different direction. Look carefully, and I think you may see that in the life of Joseph is contained another story. Almost like a preview of things to come. And if you take a good hard look at Joseph's story, you may find that you can see another story in it. The story of Christ. The story of Christ is in a way contained or previewed in the life of Joseph. So much so that when Christ came and lived among us, it was almost as though he was fulfilling or bringing to fullness what Joseph had begun many years before. And Jesus becomes the ultimate example of those final words that Joseph said. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. Maybe this little booklet can help us see that. So maybe you were already seeing this as we were reading it before, but take a look one more time at this story you have in your hands, which is written to be Joseph's story. But what parts of this story are not also Christ's story? Like, couldn't you fill the same pages with illustrations of the life of Christ? Once there was a father who had a beloved son, and he sent that son out to seek the brothers, lost humanity, who were not where they were supposed to be in their relationship to their father. Like sheep, they had gone astray. He pursued them, and he found them. Remember what the Gospel of John said? He came to that which was his own. But what? What happened? His own did not receive him. He was rejected, cast aside, friendless, alone, beaten, and stripped. And the tomb in which they put his crucified body was like the deep, dark pit of Joseph's story. They buried him in the earth. And all of Jesus' life, the promise thereof, the hope of him being something special in God's plans and God's eyes, it looks like it's just been wasted hope. That's how it seems. But God was not finished with him yet. And God saw the suffering of his beloved son and raised him up. You remember how Peter's sermon, in different words, really testifies to the same thing that Joseph's story says. God intended all of this for good. Remember, Peter stood before the crowd and he said, "This Jesus whom you crucified, that's bad, that's evil. God has made both Lord and Christ." And it was his plan to do this. God intended it for good. So God takes Jesus from the grave and raises him up, exalts him, gives him the name that's above every name so that every knee should bow before this Jesus. God takes the awful, evil cross, uses it for good. And then, this is the part that I really like, something remarkable happened. Jesus has this Joseph-like reunion. So you remember how in several of the stories that take place after the resurrection, people see Jesus, but they don't really recognize him? Luke chapter 24 is a good example of that. It's a story on the road to Emmaus. There's those two disciples. They walk 7 miles with Jesus, having a conversation with him the entire way, sit down to dinner with Jesus, and it's only after all of that that they finally recognize that he's not just the only other stranger in Jerusalem who hasn't heard all the things that have been happening all along. But they didn't recognize him at first. They didn't realize that he wasn't the one who is no more. Remember John chapter 20? Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb and she sees the empty tomb. She's walking away from the tomb. And then she sees this fellow. She supposes him to be the gardener. She doesn't recognize him until he speaks her name. And then she sees. John chapter 21, you remember that the disciples are out in a boat and they fish all night. And then some fella comes up to the shore and gives them weird fishing instructions about casting the net on the other side. And even though they probably think the guy's crazy, they go ahead and do it, and they catch all the fish in the world that they could catch. And then they realize and recognize who it actually is who's talking to them. It's interesting that just like Joseph's life, there are several moments where Jesus knows who he's talking to, but people don't recognize who he is. It's also interesting to me that the resurrection makes a point of calling the apostles Jesus' brothers. He calls them that in several places, but in particular, if you want a real concrete example. John chapter 20, verse 17. Jesus has just finished talking to Mary Magdalene, revealed himself to not be the gardener, but the Lord. And what he says to her is, "Go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." So he calls them his brothers, and he says, my Father is their Father too. And shortly after that, Jesus has a reunion with those brothers. And Judas is gone. He's out of the picture. So what does that leave us with? We had 12 apostles. Now we've got 11. 11 brothers. Joseph revealed himself to what? 11 brothers. And here Jesus is meeting once more with the 11 apostles, whom he calls his brothers, and they must be completely shocked to see him. He's alive, but at the same time, do you think maybe some of those other thoughts might be running through their minds as well? Any remembrance of the way they deserted him? The way they betrayed him? Do you think Peter has a lasting memory of denying him 3 times by that charcoal fire? He was warming himself in the courtyard. And Jesus is alive somehow. Hallelujah. They must be so excited. But in the back of his mind, I wonder if Peter's wondering, what does he think of me now? After all of that. It might have been a fearful thing coming face to face with this one who is now exalted, who's clearly more powerful than anything because they watched him die and he's still alive. And wondering, does he hold these things against me? The thing that you're truly sorry about, you remember the way that Peter went off and wept bitterly at what he had done. But you wonder if it's that thing in his life that he feels like he can't erase. And yet what does Jesus do but say, don't be afraid? What does Jesus do but come in peace and in mercy and in grace? Do you remember how 3 times Peter is restored by Jesus? Jesus asks him 3 times, do you love me? They're actually right by the fire where they're making breakfast. It's kind of like they were right by the fire when Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And right there by that fire, he says, do you love me? 3 times. And he reaffirms for Peter his love and his belonging and his purpose. Jesus speaks with them about his desire to see his Father again. And most of all, what does Jesus do after the resurrection? But he opens up the scriptures for them. I wonder if Joseph's story is part of this. I don't know. But Jesus opens up the scriptures for them to show them what? To show them a God who is able to redeem the things that his people go through for his purposes. It was necessary for the Messiah to suffer, is what Jesus says in his own words as he interprets the scriptures to the disciples. He says it was necessary for these things to happen, but what the world intended for evil, God intended for good. And all of these things that came before, and certainly what Christ has done now and what God has done through him, what they show is a God who is able to do what Joseph said so many years before, take something evil and overcome it for good. Because even when everything seemed lost and it was humanity's darkest hour, God wasn't just working on that day, he was winning. He was accomplishing his plans from long ago, overcoming evil with good. In Jesus, we have kind of like an intensified story of Joseph retold. You could say almost that Joseph's life is kind of hidden in the life of Christ. A little glimmer of what God's able to do so that when Jesus comes along, we know what we're looking at. We see the fullness of it in God's beloved Son and his resurrection. And I wonder if maybe we could see a little bit of our lives in this story as well. So if we could illustrate this story one more time, could we find ourselves in it in some way? Illustrate these pages with our own lives. Do we belong in this story too? Maybe we belong in the place of the brothers in this story. Those brothers felt that they had done something that could never be erased. The stain upon their lives could not be cleansed. And they certainly had a hard time trusting that Joseph, of all people, could actually forgive them. Do we need to draw ourselves on those pages into that story so that we can remember that the God who seemingly impossibly lives, possibly forgives as far as the east is from the west? And even when it's beyond our comprehension to imagine how God might forgive us, God continues to whisper like Joseph did, "Do not be afraid." Or like Jesus did, "Peace be with you." "Simon, do you love me? Do you love me?" Maybe we need to find ourselves in this story and know that we can be forgiven. Or maybe the place we need to draw ourselves in this story is in the place of Joseph. The thing that probably amazes me the most about Joseph is that he comes to the conclusion himself. What you did for evil, God intended for good. Something strange happens throughout the book of Genesis. If you read the part about Abraham, you could go through and count how many times it says things like, "The Lord God said to Abraham." The Lord God said to Abraham this or that or this or that or this. There's a lot of them. Abraham is pictured having like the whole conversations with the Lord, even arguing with him sometimes about, "Suppose we find 10 faithful people in that city. Could you spare it, Lord?" Jacob's life is kind of like that too. In Joseph's life, you could check me on this, but I think it's accurate. I don't think there's a single time that you have that dialogue kind of thing happening between Joseph and the Lord, like with Abraham and like with Jacob. In that way, his life is a little more like ours. And God is at work in his life. But Joseph has to faithfully wrestle with that and sit with it and reflect on it. And then later on, looking back, he can see it. And I wonder if that's the part of the story we might need to be drawn into as well. It may be that there are times in our lives when, try as we might to see how God is in it, how God is involved in our lives, we can't figure it out. There may be times like that. There may be things that happen in our lives that, try as we might our whole life long, we never really understand. But if we believe that there is a God who is able to overcome evil with good, and if we believe that that God is active in our lives, then we may find, when we wrestle and look back at where we've been, that perhaps God has been involved in shaping our lives and story. But we may never see that unless we're willing to hold on to faith, stick with it, and really reflect on God's place in our lives and our place in his story. Maybe that's something you need today. Faithful Christians can faithfully reflect upon the world in our lives and be open to the ways that God is still at work, overcoming evil for good in us. Maybe that's what you need a bit of today. Whatever this lesson may say to us, I hope that we will truly reflect on the power of a God who's able to redeem evil for good. Without that quality in God, there's not a whole lot of hope in the world. But if there is a God who is still greater than the evil in this world and is able to redeem our lives and our struggles in it, then we have a great hope indeed. Maybe you can be challenged to be like someone in this story, like the brothers who learn to be forgiven, like Joseph who learns to wrestle with the things of life and hold on to faith. Maybe somebody needs to respond to the gospel as seen in Jesus Christ himself, who was sent for us and gave his life for us. However you might be called or challenged, let's give a moment to respond as we stand and sing.